today's show, it is the eve of the NBA Finals. And Jake Coyne joins the show for a deep dive into what lessons we can learn about building a championship roster in the age of parity. We ask whether the clock has run out on the Denver Nuggets title window for the current core. But first, big markets are making big moves. Thibs is out on the New York Knicks. We discuss this and more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to What's in a Game. I'm Grace Jean, here with our special guest and new friend of the show, Jake Coyne, aka the Stats Squatch. How are you doing today, Jake?
Doing really well, guys. Happy to be here. Happy to chat. Always a busy time of year.
Yeah, I bet, especially, around NBA playoff time. We have a lot to get into in today's show. But before we jump into the news, we have quite a few program notes. So I'll try to get through these real quickly. First off, we are not doing a Pacers Thunder finals preview for this series. I've just been too busy to do the level of deep dive that I normally do for the, to give you guys quality content. But there are a lot of great finals previews out there. One I highly recommend is the one from Caitlin Cooper's YouTube channel. She's a writer who follows the Pacers, and she writes a blog called Basketball She Wrote. I loved the series preview that she did with Samson Folk over on her YouTube channel. So definitely check that out. We will be talking about the actual basketball games once the finals start, talking X's and O's, all that fun stuff. The games are actually way more spaced out now than they were during the conference semifinals and the conference finals, actually to a comical degree. I don't remember if this was the case over the last two finals, but there are 3 days in between games. So game, 2 days off, and then game on that third day. Between every single game except games 3 and 4, which there will just be the 1 day's rest. So we'll have more deep dive opportunities, plenty of time for me to dig into the film before I come to you all and talk about the interesting things that we are finding. Next week, I'm very excited to announce that we are going to have Denver Stiffs legend Jeff Morton on the show to ask about the curious case of Josh Kroenke, the Nuggets, the current, acting governor of the Denver Nuggets, and what he's getting up to. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes with the Nuggets in this show when we talk about the lack of a general manager. Please do us a favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps us out with the algorithm. We're still trying to grow the channel. We've got our 1,000 sub goal by the end of the playoffs, and we're currently at 934. So I actually think we could do it if you guys help us out. So again, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button on the video as well, and definitely hit the notification bell so that you don't miss our content. All right, Jake, we're diving into a big story that happened just yesterday. Tom Thibodeau has been, quote unquote, relieved of duty as head coach of the New York Knicks. What was your first thought when you saw this news?
I think initially I was a little bit surprised just because, in recent years, the Knicks haven't had the most success, over the last couple decades. And thinking about their playoff run this year, I mean, beating the Celtics was a really good accomplishment. Getting to the conference finals, really strong. But I think it was good of them to maybe not overreact to that beating the Celtics. If you were to play that series 10 times, how many times do the Knicks beat the Celtics?
How many times do they have two 20-point cuts, two second half 20-point comebacks in the same series?
And so, I think it was good of them to not look at that and say, oh, we did everything that we wanted to do because we beat the Celtics. And so yeah, I mean, initially definitely some surprise, but also just kind of based on how that team's constructed and stuff, I think it makes sense for them to go a different direction. I think maybe Thibodeau's stay has worn a little thin with some of those players. So
Yeah, that is really my biggest takeaway from the firing. We did have some comments from Mikal Bridges within the last couple of weeks about how Tib, like, he basically sort of gently, but the fact that it's public, nudging Tibbs in the direction of using more bench players, that definitely stuck out to a lot of people, myself included. And I think that just says more about the dynamic between Tibbs and this current crop of players than it necessarily does like just the like his quality as a coach. It seems like the fit was not necessarily there anymore. And this isn't the same Knicks team as it was last year and previous years, right? Obviously, you have Karl Anthony Towns there, and Mikal Bridges is another new addition from last off season. You did talk about the fact that they beat the Celtics and not being satisfied with just doing that. It's funny because a lot of people talked about how it's like, well, the Knicks they got Cat to try to match up with the Celtics, and then they beat the Celtics, and now they like couldn't beat the Pacers. I mean, they didn't beat the Pacers last year either. I don't actually think that the Cat move. I think they did do it to try to match up with the Celtics, like that plus the Mikal move, and OG. Like I think that was like trying to get more wingy. And then the Cat move was more, we need a center. He's the best one available. Let's just go after him and use this, this Julius Randle contract to get something, an upgrade at another position. I don't actually think they're a good matchup for the Boston Celtics. I think the Celtics really like imploded. Like they really beat themselves in that series. So a lot of people have kind of, I've seen the thought that maybe they should have traded Cat instead of, firing the head coach. But obviously it's always going to be easier to fire your head coach than change the roster.
Yeah, for sure. And, just thinking about the Knicks going forward, I think it takes a special brand of like superstar player to work well with Tibbs. And I think, in the next couple of years, the Knicks would like to bring in maybe another really high caliber player. And maybe it would be easier under a different coaching style. I don't think everybody's made for that kind of system and just sort of, high minute totals that Tibbs puts on his best players. And so we'll see if this next coach is like a big swing to a different coaching style than what Tibbs was.
Yeah. We have this comment, crazy that Tibbs gets fired after Jalen Brunson said he's the right guy for the job. And you sort of alluded to Cat being the superstar of this team. And I mean, he was in the Eastern Conference Finals. I don't think Jalen Brunson was the best Nick like across the length of that series. It's just funny because like they couldn't survive the bad Cat games. But in previous years, like Brunson was the superstar of this team.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was pretty much established in 2023, the 22-23 season, when it was sort of like, well, Julius Randle's the best player on this team, and then Brunson has his breakout season in New York, and then last year I think it's pretty much solidified. He's finished top 5 in MVP. Like he's the guy, on this team. So I think that was also an interesting dynamic because Brunson had a like slightly not down year per se, but down relative to again last season he finished top 5 in MVP, and then Cat comes in and he was having a great season in the regular season, and then he had some some really big impactful playoff games as well, especially in the conference finals. And I sort of wonder, when people talk about Tibbs needing to diversify things more instead of running so much through Brunson, although I feel like they did that, honestly, in the at least in the conference finals. And I did watch large parts of the Pistons as well as the Celtics series as well. Is that just like, well, Brunson is our best player and he's the one whose decision making I trust, versus, if they did bring in higher level superstar talent than Karl Anthony Towns, does that dynamic change? And do you have to sort of factor that in when you make the decision to fire Thibs as well? I don't know. Maybe they're not
Yeah.
thinking that far ahead. I tend to not put that much forethought on people that are making these decisions, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they probably take into account a lot of stuff. I think with Brunson specifically, one thing that's interesting with him is if you asked a bunch of people, who are the top 5 NBA players, he probably wouldn't show up in most of those lists. But then if you ask a lot of people who are the top 5, closers among NBA stars, he probably shows up a little more often
Yeah.
in that one.
I mean, he did win Clutch Player of the Year.
Right.
I thought he earned it.
And I think Towns is kind of the opposite of that,
Yeah.
where you trust him less when the game gets tight. You want the ball in his hands a little less. And so I do think they become a little over reliant on Brunson when things get tight. And yeah, I mean, I think Cat, you probably want to see, are you able to upgrade? Maybe not from him directly, maybe he's still on the team or whatever, but are you able to upgrade and get somebody that's a little more of a whole game helper to what Brunson can do, as opposed to Cat, who I think they trust a little less when the game gets tight. And I think there's good reasons for that. And so, I don't know that they'll switch up their roster too much now that they're changing coaches. My guess is it would probably be maybe some tweaks around the edges, and they run it back mostly, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And I think a lot of people have sort of said, hey, this isn't going to be a good defensive team because of the roster, so we have to try to maximize the offense. The Knicks were great offense this year. Actually, that's despite Brunson missing a large stretch at the end of the season with a pretty gnarly ankle injury right before and then came back right before the end of the season, so he was able to ramp up before the playoffs. So it's kind of actually, given that he missed that many games and how much it seemed like their offense was going to struggle without him, kind of a miracle that they won 51 games this year. But people want a more creative, quote unquote, creative offensive coach to sort of maximize that side of the ball and sort of give up on the idea that Thibs could turn this into a good defense. Before we move on, I do want to point to people to an interesting piece that Stefano wrote in Sporting News. Basically puts forth the idea that Thibs' creativity is actually unappreciated by fans. But he has this great quote in there. It says, quote, ask his players or advanced scouts around the league. They'll tell you he has one of the thickest playbooks in the NBA. I actually thought the Knicks tried a lot of different things offensively in this series against the Pacers. I thought the defense was a much bigger issue. And it was honestly much more personnel based than scheme based. But, I think they were ready to move on from Thibs. The rumblings about whether he was going to keep this job were going on well before the playoffs even started, and it was very like, well, if they don't make it through this Pistons series, he's out. Or, oh, if they blow this 3-1 lead against the Celtics, he's out. Then they make the conference finals, losing 6. After going down 3-1, with after a really, I think, pretty bad collapse in game 1, and I think maybe his death warrant was signed there because if they didn't win that series, they could point to that and be like, well, grumble, this is the thing we're going to use, and they just wanted to make that change. All right. Knicks coaching candidates actually related to this. We've seen a couple names floating around there, including Jay Wright, who's former head coach of the Villanova Wildcats. I've seen multiple places, which I was kind of surprised about because I wouldn't think that a team that fashions itself a championship contender would want to hire a first-time NBA head coach. But of course, that Villanova connection is there. And then Johnny Bryant, who is the current lead assistant for the Cleveland Cavaliers and was previously listed as a finalist for the Suns head coaching job before we get to our second news item because the Suns hired somebody else. But do either of those names stand out to you as an interesting sort of fit for the Knicks here?
Yeah, so when I wrote my offseason report for the Nuggets, it was a couple months process, and I actually had a full page in there on Johnny Bryant,
Oh, yeah.
who was my preferred coaching candidate prior to them hiring David Adelman. And so I did a lot of research on him, sort of his background, and I think he'd be a great fit for the Knicks. He was obviously there previously as an assistant. Um,
Oh, that's
kind
right.
of
He does have that history there as well.
Yep, and some of his specialties are sort of I think he's really good with players, but he's also very good at holding people accountable, which is one of the reasons I thought he'd be a good fit in Denver. Was that he's kind of helped push Donovan Mitchell to a little bit higher of a level than I think he was previously, um, and it's been through a lot of, I don't know, tough love, I guess you could say. They're very connected, but he's also very good at holding him accountable. And so I think the Knicks could use that. Karl Anthony Towns needs someone to hold him accountable a little bit. Um, and I think he'd just be able to establish a good relationship with some of the players there. So I think Johnny Bryant is a great hire for whoever may get him. Um, and then beyond those guys, I'd probably also just keep an eye on Mike Brown. I think he's someone that they'll probably talk to, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I actually love that you bring that up, that he has this reputation for holding players accountable, because so much of what we normally hear when these coaching searches are going on and when different fan bases are chiming in about what they want for their team, it's about like we want creativity in the offense, or we want like, sort of generally, a culture setter and that kind of thing, and maybe that falls under that umbrella. But that specific trait or ability to hold players accountable doesn't always necessarily come up at this stage of the process. So I really like that you brought that up. All right, so let's talk about a related news item to that. As I stated, Johnny Bryant was a finalist for the Phoenix Suns head coaching gig, but we just got news about an hour before the show that the Phoenix Suns have decided to hire Jordan Ott, another assistant for the Cleveland Cavaliers, as the next head coach of their team. I've seen Suns fans being happy because he's known for his creative offensive and defensive schemes. I've also seen some people saying that he got this job because he's a Michigan State alum and Matt Ishbia takes care of his people. I'm sure he's also very qualified for this job. I've seen his name sort of floating around in, other coaching searches as well. But I don't know too much about Jordan Ott. But the Suns seem pretty impressed with him. Any thoughts on this particular hire for the Suns? It seems to follow a trend that we've been seeing for the last, I would say, 2 coaching cycles, where largely the guys that are getting hired are assistants either getting promoted internally or assistants getting a chance at a new team to be a head coach and sort of bring fresh blood to the mix.
Yeah, so I don't have a ton of like specific thoughts on him. He wasn't one of the guys I researched for the Nuggets. There
Mm-hmm.
was a handful of others, but just kind of speaking from an overall perspective, Kenny Atkinson there in Cleveland is kind of known to um, keep some of his top assistants really involved. And so, like, I'm not surprised
Mm.
that him and Johnny Bryant are um, making their way deep into these coaching candidate searches. Um, and we did also see the report that, Devin Booker had some type of say in this hire. And I think it's always good practice to, as long as you're planning on keeping that guy around, which it seems like the Suns are, it's always good practice to keep those guys involved and have their opinions hold a little bit of weight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since we've already alluded to a little bit of, what your connection is to Nuggets fandom in, your drafting of this 50-page off-season guide, let's talk about that part of your background a little bit, Jake. Um, First off, how did you become a Nuggets fan in the first place? And then maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about what inspired your, transformation into a sort of NBA salary cap and draft nerd, and what inspired you to write this annual Nuggets offseason guide?
Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up in Denver and have always loved sports, playing and watching them. But I'd say kind of what made me the biggest Nuggets fan was Carmelo Anthony and J.R. Smith.
We get
Those
that
were
answer
two
a lot.
guys that I just loved watching. Got me so excited growing up to watch every Nuggets game just to see what those guys would do. So it made it a really enjoyable experience. And then kind of as time went on, the thing that sort of got me into CBA stuff was actually what year would it have been? Probably the mid
Did they do
2010s.
something dumb? Did the front office do something dumb and you were like, what is going on here?
Well, they had tried to do something. So what had happened was they were trying to re-sign Kenneth Faried to an
Okay.
extension, and there was some reports that came out with some numbers. It was like, oh, it's 5 years and some number, and then they drew back on those reports and they said, oh no, that was actually an illegal contract they were trying to give Faried, because at the time you couldn't extend a guy 5 years on a rookie contract unless it was a max deal. And so the Nuggets, for whatever reason, the reports came out that they were trying to do something illegally there, right? And so that's kind of what got me into the CBA originally. Was I was curious about, like, why did that happen? What were they thinking of doing? And so then you kind of dig into it, you start reading it, you start looking at resources online, and it just became something I really enjoyed doing and being able to talk to people about. And then it kind of formed into what it is now, which is some of these reports that I put out. Um, and I do it, a lot of it's just to try and kind of help educate people, I think. I don't like discourse that's just really uninformed about
Yeah,
things that could never happen.
I
And
feel
so,
that.
so if I can, put in a few hours on my end to try and help educate people on some of these rules, maybe some of the things the Nuggets might be thinking, that's always been worthwhile to me. And so,
Because it helps elevate the discourse that you
mhm.
have with people as well. Because it's not that any fan can have a good idea, but their idea can be even better informed if they understand the rules of engagement, right?
Yep, exactly. And, I've always enjoyed talking about how to build these teams and stuff. It's really fun to me. And so being able to sort of elevate that level of discourse has always been worth it to me, and enables me to go on to this show and go on to other shows and just be able to talk basketball, which is ultimately one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I like fully relate to that. Actually, so since we're on the topic, I actually forgot to mention this in the programming notes. We're not going to talk about this piece on the show, but I actually decided to write an article. I was inspired by Zeke Najee's contract. So I actually wrote a whole piece about the pitfalls of long-term contracts sort of broadly under the new CBA. So if anybody that is interested in that can check it out. It's not Nuggets specific. I use Zeke Najee's contract as a case study to talk about trends more broadly throughout the league, and I use other contracts as examples throughout. I'll link that in the description of the show as well, so you guys can check that out. If you do want us to have a show where I talk about just what's going on with Zeke Najee's contract and long-term contracts, we can do that. I don't know that our audience wants me to cap nerd out quite to that extent, but I am excited to have Jake on the show to sort of touch on similar topics, because we are actually going to talk about some of the example mock off seasons that Jake has in his off season guide, and talk about some of the suggestions that he has for the team, including some listener questions that we got before the show. But thanks for sharing your background, Jake. All right, let's move on to our first segment here, the curious case of the Denver Nuggets general manager, a whodunit, or rather a who is it, because we still don't have a general manager. It has been 57 days since Denver had a GM, since Josh fired Calvin Booth. We've heard reports and speculated that it might just be Ben Tenzer, who was named interim GM after that firing, and who, according to Josh, has done a, quote, unbelievable job over the last 2 months doing things. And we've also speculated that the GM could be someone else, or that they could, in fact, hire somebody external to take over a sort of supervisory president of basketball operations gig to sort of be figurehead, basically, above Ben, and sort of mediate any disputes and sort of what's the word that Josh used? Policing the culture in the organization. But, it's interesting because Josh said we don't need a total cultural reset, but maybe we need a chaperone is what I took from that. But honestly, I'm still not convinced that the next general manager isn't just going to be Ben Tenzer. So, Jake, I ask, what is taking them so long to draft Ben Tenzer's intro package?
Well, I think if you were to ask, the most skeptic Nuggets fan, I guess, I think they would tell you that that decision's already been made and that it is going to be Tenzer.
That's me. I'm the most skeptic.
And that they're sort of delaying it to maybe put on a appearance of a really thorough search when perhaps it hasn't been as thorough as some people would like. If you ask my opinion, do I think Tenzer is going to be the next GM? I do. However, I don't know that there's been a decision made yet on if there will be someone above him. And I think that's maybe where they're looking right now is, do we want to bring in a Matt Lloyd from Minnesota, put him as our president of basketball operations, and then put Tenzer right below him as our GM? I think that's probably what they're looking at still. And it may end up just being Tenzer and no one else above him. But I do think they probably are still thinking about how can we bring in someone to put above him. And, the Timberwolves weren't eliminated that long ago. So those conversations could still be happening. And so if you want to look at things from a little bit more of a hopeful perspective, I would say that's probably it. However, at the end of the day, I would say I'd be surprised if Tenzer is not some type of decision maker for the Nuggets next season, whether that's the top one or right below it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that the decision's probably already been made, and Josh has sort of been, we've gotten 3 press conferences from Josh over the last 2 months, and 2 of them have been, unbelievably glowing about Ben Tenzer. In the most recent one, the introductory press conference for new head coach David Adelman. He talked about how Ben has all these ideas about how the front office can improve internally and externally. And so feels like he's sort of planting the seeds for this guy's great, guys, I promise, and he's just sort of, waiting for that moment.
I would say,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry to butt in on you, but just kind of piggybacking off that, Tenzer, he's helped with a lot of stuff in the G League and stuff, more like player development type things. So I do think if we're looking at different styles of GMs, and Josh truly believes in his heart that the best way forward is sort of internal development, Tenzer does make a lot of sense if that's what you're doing. Yeah. Even if, you say, I would prefer somebody that's really connected with agents, and maybe has a little bit more of an outside perspective on things. That's just me, though. And, if Josh thinks internal development is the path, I think that Tenzer makes a lot of sense for that.
Yeah, and I think, and this is going to help lead us into our next topic here, the thing that people really want to have with an outside perspective is just being able to look at the roster a little bit in a little bit more cold and calculated terms than we have when we're talking about a GM who might, has been here his entire career, like, from the time he was interning around college time, uh, and has a few less attachments to various players on the roster and can sort of assess where we're at here. We have a comment. The Nugs need to get someone with a Brooklyn Nets connection for GM. I know that'd be so great because they're the team with all the cap space this summer. We could really use those 2025 draft picks and salary cap space to dump for our bench. Well, I was thinking more about the salary cap space to dump some players there. I have this tinfoil hat theory that I shared with you, Jake, online a few weeks ago that I talked about on the show, where I think that they're going to try to use a future first to trade into this draft and also like simultaneously salary dump some things. So I could actually see that exact scenario happening. So very smart. It's a very smart viewer there. But again, tinfoil hat theory, it's not necessarily happening. It's just I'm not going to take it off the table until the draft is done because it could happen as late as actual draft night. But yeah, we want somebody who's going to be able to assess the roster in sort of colder terms. But let's talk about the actual Denver Nuggets roster because we need to figure out what it is that this team needs, whether it's going to come from, external help or internal development, as Josh was sort of banging that drum at the last press conference. So the first question I've got for you on this, and I know it's really hard to assess because looking at the way that the Nuggets played in the playoffs versus the regular season, it's so evident that the vibes during the regular season were as low as they possibly could have been. But just based on the regular season, before we talk about the playoff needs, do you think that Denver had roster issues that were specific to the regular season? As they did clearly struggle relative to past years. And or was 80% of that or more due to the level of caring?
Yeah, I think there was regular season roster issues, and I think it can be boiled down to something as simple as your coach is trying to win games. You need to give him at least some players that he feels helps him achieve that goal. And I think Calvin Booth and the Nuggets swung so far in the direction of trying to force his hand into playing players that they thought would be good, that it created this issue of just such an imbalanced roster. We saw the starters playing together a ton of minutes once again. And we also
when they were healthy, which was not actually all that much this season.
And we also saw a massive disparity between the top 7 or so players in total minutes, and then a big gap. And then you get down to Zeke and all those players. And so I think there was a roster issue in the sense that you could have balanced that a little better, even if it was just a Justin Holiday or something that you had as an option. And then, say he gets injured during the season or whatever, and then Coach Malone has to move to one of those younger guys. I mean, that's a lot more natural of a process of things than just trying to force a guy into playing these young draft picks right away on a team with such high expectations. And so from that point of view, I would say, yeah, there was a regular season roster issue, and I think there will be going forward unless they bring in some new faces.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think I completely agree with everything that you just said, and one of the things just to play off of that a little bit is just we had so many young guys, right? So you can play a few really good minutes. I put out some tweets about this a few weeks ago, but Peyton Watson I think was 13th in his draft class in total minutes this season. This is a guy who went in the back of the first round, and yeah, there were some busts in that draft, but that's one of the ways I'm sort of gauging is Malone underplaying these young guys, quote unquote? Not really. Julian Strother also I think he was 16th in his draft class in total minutes, which is even more surprising to me because I think he struggles more defensively than a lot of guys in his class, and that was also a pretty rich draft class in 2023 as well. So he's playing more than guys that some of the names, surprised me in that sense. Peyton Watson is playing just a little bit less than Jabari Smith Jr., who was the 3rd overall pick in that draft. But then when you get to we have to play Peyton Watson, and we have when you're trying to get the coach to play Peyton Watson, Julian Strother, Jalen Pickett, Hunter Tyson, all these guys that need developmental reps, but they all also have to play with Jokic. But also there's this simultaneous complaints of well, they're not playing long enough stints, but also we need to play 11 guys. It's just some dueling, some conflicting sort of goals there because we have so many young guys. I do think for me, the main regular season gap, I think that I saw, obviously the defensive side of the ball was the more sort of resonant issue during the regular season because it was effort and execution to a pretty high degree. But I felt we lacked high motor defensive players. It was interesting because early in the season, it felt like Russell Westbrook was our best defender for some reason. That wasn't necessarily a good thing. He's good, but he comes off the bench. He's 36 years old, all of this stuff, right? And that's one of those things that helps you get through the regular season because you've got this guy that's willing to do the fly around stuff, that's willing to chase guys over screens, all this stuff. It felt like on every play where there was a breakdown, everybody just gave up.
Yep.
And that was both effort, but also I think that's where, you don't necessarily think of KCP as that guy, but he was a pretty high motor. He was ready to get those offensive foul calls on moving screens every single night. He's fighting through those things constantly. And for the people that are well, they couldn't keep KCP. He was too expensive, all this stuff. I'm not saying that they needed to keep KCP, but I think that was a miscalculation that they made when they didn't sort of backfill that within the roster. Peyton Watson can be a good defensive player, but he's not a high motor guy. Christian Brown moving into his role as a starter with starter minutes and all of that. He used to be that high motor guy off the bench, but I feel like he was sort of redistributing his efforts a little bit more in this season as he tried to sort of adapt to being a starter. And I think the defensive side of the ball definitely took the hit there as he was putting the motor all on offense and sort of being Giannis in transition in the regular season.
Yeah, and I think, just kind of watching other teams in the playoffs, and I think this applies to the Nuggets regular season as well, is I was kind of struck at just how quick some of these other teams look on defense.
Yeah.
When you think about the Nuggets starting five, Jokic, MPJ, and Murray, none of those guys are quick defensively. No. And I would put Brown and Gordon more into a category of disciplined and smart defenders rather than quick ones. And so, I think you see that and you're well, our quickest defender's Russell Westbrook, and he's in his late 30s. He might not be here next year. We'll see. Peyton Watson is definitely explosive, but I think both him and Strother to a lot greater degree, they need to work on their defensive IQ in order to be flying around to the same degree we see some of these other players on other teams flying around defensively. And so that was one thing that struck me kind of just watching all these other teams in the playoffs was I was man, some of these guys defensively are just flying around and making life difficult for the opposing offense. And I just don't think they haven't been like that. They don't. Yeah. They
don't make the opposing offense uncomfortable in any way right now. Yeah.
I mean, they can with their length and with kind of their, intelligence defensively.
They have to actually use it though. You gotta have active hands. You gotta fly around. And like I said with Peyton Watson, the reason I don't put him in the category of high motor, when he does play with energy, you feel him, right? But that's not an every night thing, for example. I'm actually glad that you brought up Julian because I do think that he's got Will hates this term when people use it. He's got like a sneaky high motor, but his body control is like non-existent, so he's just constantly flying into guys and like fouling
Yeah.
them. Um, but yeah, that combination of, as you're saying, sort of defensive IQ and motor, we're lacking in any like one player on this roster. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about the offensive side of the ball. I think it's pretty evident that David Adelman, new head coach, who we've talked about on this show, especially after his introductory presser and some of the other media hits that he's done since he was named head coach, he has sort of emphasized that offensively, both in the regular season and the playoffs, it feels like his assessment is that the issue was effort and execution, because he's talked about we need to be better about like making contact on our screens, becoming an execution team, and beating teams up with sort of rigorous, relentless execution, especially in the half court. We became a transition team for like 3/4 of this last season, right? But Adelman said that stuff really broke down in the playoffs. Actually, I'm going to transition to a bit of a question that leads us into our playoff discussion here. But is the reason that David Adelman is focusing so much on execution of these details over what a lot of people would have said they would have liked to hear out of the new head coach, which is recreating the system around Jokic and, being more, people use this word, creative with our offense? Because honestly, a lot of the most creative schemes just get scouted out in the playoffs. The Grizzlies didn't even take until the playoffs to sort of solve this revolutionary sort of pinwheel type offense that they had going on for large stretches of this season that they were receiving a lot of praise for. The Cavs, now they struggled both shooting, but and also with injuries in the playoffs. But I would also say that a lot of their motion sets that were the source of the quote unquote cavalanches that would just overwhelm teams in the regular season got scouted out, and their offense eventually devolved into Donovan Mitchell, can you get us a bucket here? And then I think the most prominent example of an explosive offense becoming easy to guard when you know the tendencies of, a system that was designed to be very creative, is the Warriors and their motion offense. And obviously it helps that they no longer have Kevin Durant next to Steph Curry, or that any other player on that team can actually looks at the rim outside of Steph Curry. But they are easy to scout, and you can everything sort of boils down to, can you execute your pick and roll that, can flow out of other actions, but eventually like you got to get to that thing, your bread and butter.
Yes, I think when it comes to the execution thing, a lot of times we as fans will think of execution as just being in the right place at the right time, running a play correctly, something like that. But I think when we talk about execution from like a coaching perspective, I think there's also like an element of just do your job on that play. And if your job on that play is to hit an open shot, like that's part of execution.
Yeah, that's true.
You need to be able to execute and hit that open shot. And so I think, when David Adelman kind of talks about we need to execute better, you can look at that a lot of different ways, as not only, hey, you need to be in the right place, but also like you need to do your job on this play, which involves not turning it over. It involves hitting the shot when it comes to you. And I think for certain players on the team, it involves taking the shot when you're supposed to take it. I think there's players on the Nuggets that can be a little tight and maybe try to pass up on a good shot for what they hope will be a great shot, but it doesn't always end up coming when you wait for it like that. That's when a lot of times we'll see Jamal sort of pass up on an open three and go into some of these contested twos, or we'll see Christian pass up on an open three and pass it along to the next guy.
At the end of the shot clock.
Right. Yeah, those guys
Lots
need
of
to
grenades.
execute, and they need to do what their job is on that play. And that involves being aggressive, and taking that shot when it's there. And so, yeah, I think, going forward for the Nuggets, they need to execute like David Adelman says. And when it comes to the playoffs, each team you play in the playoffs is going to present different issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your job to figure out how to solve those problems based on your personnel. And so the Nuggets have guys that are limited defensively. They have guys that can be limited offensively. And so they have to figure out how to execute with the personnel that they do have. And so that's kind of like the big issue here is, do we need different personnel to try and execute this plan? Or can we just do a better job going forward, and maybe some internal development gets us to that level?
Well, that's the big question here, right? Because, going into our broader sort of roster building lessons from the playoffs, Will and I talked about this before the season, where, in trying to assess the job that a coach has done, you sort of have to take a step back and ask yourself whether the general manager has done their job. And we sort of came up with or maybe it was just me, I can't remember, a rubric to say like, hey, like the general manager did their job. And I think that the general manager of the Denver Nuggets, their job is to put together a roster that can be reasonably expected to at least make the Western Conference Finals. And from there, it's all the players, it's all the coaches. And I say expected because if you have a roster that, is of the caliber that I'm thinking of, and they have Nikola Jokic, I'm like, this team should be able to make the Western Conference Finals. I think Denver had that last year. Even though I would have wanted them to have one more piece. Last year's playoff failures, I think, were a lot more about Jamal not, playing to his standard and also being, relatedly being injured. And the starting unit really having nothing. Like, it turned out to be one of the worst lineups played in the playoffs last year. So it's kind of a miracle that they got as far as they did. That was not the case this year, where the starters were actually pretty good. But the rest of the roster was really, really, lacking in that way. I think when they lost KCP and Justin Holiday in the same summer, they lose both shooting and experience. And frankly, just like another guy that can make it so that like Peyton Watson doesn't have to play every single playoff game, because there are just going to be ones where he probably shouldn't play. But that was, again, like you alluded to earlier, that was by design. But overall, let's start with the defensive side of the ball. What was your evaluation of how the Nuggets looked in the playoffs on that side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I was pleasantly surprised
Yeah.
with how they played defensively. I would say they exceeded my expectation going into the playoffs a little bit. Um,
Do you
I
think that was
think,
more due to the effort? A lot of people have, made a lot of the new schemes that Adelman sort of tried out, especially in the OKC series. But really, I remember they came out in game one against the Clippers in a 2-3 zone that I was like, what are we doing? Because they gave up over 30 points in that first quarter. And I was like, what is going on right now? Nobody knows where to be. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's probably a lot. It's probably a combination of a lot of things. So I think there's some scheme stuff in there. I think there's some like defensive play call stuff, because I think like a zone, even though I thought the Nuggets didn't play the zone very well, I think it's less taxing on Jokic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that helps um, defensively when he has a little more energy out there.
Yeah.
I think they were a lot better about getting back in transition in the playoffs than they were in the regular season. I don't know if that's scheme or if that's effort. I'd have to really go back and look at why that was the case to understand that. And then I also just think that there was. So I think the teams the Nuggets played don't present all the issues that give the Nuggets the most problems defensively, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
I completely agree with that. That was going to be my next question, which is, does the fact that Denver played some relatively limited offenses impact your assessment of, because we're talking about the roster, our defensive personnel?
yep. Yeah, so I think like let's think about the Timberwolves, right? That's the team everybody's scared of. Uh they can stretch you out. They have a guard in Anthony Edwards who can drive by pretty much everybody on the Nuggets roster. I don't think they played a player like that. SGA drives a lot, but I think it's a lot easier to send help for him based on your scheme than it is somebody like Edwards. And so, yeah, I think, you know, overall the defense exceeded my expectation, but I am aware of the fact that they didn't play teams that I think test them to the highest degree defensively. I think Minnesota tests them a lot. I think Golden State tests them a lot. Um, who else would I say? Those would probably be like the main two out west. I think the Lakers, maybe.
Depends on what they do,
Yeah.
because I don't think that that is a complete enough roster right now to where you can't just not even play guys off the floor, because I don't think they want to put in the guys that are behind the guys that get played off the floor,
Yeah.
given their current roster. I like that you're listing some other teams here, because my next question was, we've made this observation in the last few weeks that it seems like the East has become the high-paced offensive conference, and the Pacers have a lot to do with that, but they're not the only team that has sort of elevated the level of offensive play in the Eastern Conference. The Cavs as well. The Knicks had a really interesting sort of offensive season, and obviously the Celtics have always been around there. But the West has turned into just a bunch of defensive teams that sort of beat you up and slow things down into the half court. Does Denver have to be more concerned with the offensive side of the ball now than really the defensive side, because they're like, look, like, we know when it comes down to it, these other teams are so defensively skewed, with not just how they play but their personnel, that we can probably figure out ways to get stops on them, but our offense has to be able to get through their defenses.
Yeah, I think it is a concern going forward. Just because of what you're saying, you look at the teams around the West. Oklahoma City isn't going anywhere. Houston, very good defensively, will probably be around for a little while. And then Minnesota, we'll see what Gobert looks like the next couple years, but they should be good defensively for a little while. And when you look at the Nuggets roster, if a team is playing you really well defensively, sometimes you just need guys that can break things down off the dribble.
Yes.
And kind of force the defense into rotation, force them into movement. And that's kind of where Jokic can expose some weak points in the defense, is when things are moving around. And the Nuggets, that would be the main problem for me, is they just don't have a lot of guys that can just be like, hey, nothing's working right now. They're smothering Jokic. We need to break this defense down a little. And they just don't have a ton of that. And so I think going forward, that would probably be my main concern offensively, and maybe my main concern, on court for the team as a whole, is how can we get this team to be a little bit more stronger at attacking off the dribble? Because I think it makes life easier for everybody else if they're able to do that.
I completely 1,000,000% agree with you, Jake. Our next topic was just going to be about how Adelman has identified consistent shooting as the primary skill set he'd want to add to the team. The question was about the bench, but I don't think that shooting is the biggest offensive deficit of this team, which is, pretty shocking, because we don't have anybody that I trust to make a three outside of Aaron Gordon, which is, if you asked me, if I said that 2 years ago, everyone would look at me like I had three heads. But for me, it's downhill creation, like you're saying, attacking off the dribble. I think that Russ, during his good portion of the season, and even during the Clippers series, where I think he was just great for 7 games or for 6 games, because he did miss one, Bruce and Will Barton are the proof of concept of that, and how dynamic our offense can look when you have guys that can beat others off the dribble. And then you're able to take some creation burden off of both Jokic and Jamal. And then it makes it easier, as you say, to actually set up your best players to take and make easier shots, as opposed to it's constantly Jokic and Jamal 2-man game and having to kick out to guys that you do or don't trust to make a three, right? And like you're talking about having someone that can beat guys off the dribble and put the defense into rotation can actually bend the defense, whereas guys that make shots versus a defense that's trying to load up against the 2-man game or even just against Jokic in the post, they're not going to change how they defend the 2-man game or Jokic in the post, even if those guys are making shots. And that's not a Jokic specific thing, although part of it is because they're like, well, we are just freaking terrified of that man who is the best player in the world. So we're going to do our best to try to keep it out of his hands, both figuratively and literally. But teams like the Rockets, teams like OKC, this is just how they guard. They're like, no, we're going to create our shell and you can shoot as many threes as you want. You have to be able to break down that shell, right? So you don't have to constantly be playing into the defense's hands. Like, you don't want the defense to dictate your offense. And I feel like having more guys that could beat others off the dribble would help with that. Yeah. So I love that you brought that up. We didn't plan this, guys.
No, not at all. But yeah, I think about, like, you know, from Adelman's point of view, and he obviously knows 100 times more about basketball than I ever could, but
right.
I think
like you said, I think he agrees with you that part of execution is making shots. So I think he would like to have guys that can make those shots. But I think the other part that you identified also is, like, not having those record scratch possessions where you should have taken an open shot and you didn't do it. Yeah. I think that's also important. But like I said, I agree with you with the off the dribble stuff, but please go on.
Yeah. And no, I was just thinking that, you know, I think in his point of view, it's like, okay, we're going to give the Jokic Murray pick and roll maximum space to operate. And if you helped over too far, we're going to hit shots and it's going to punish you for helping too much on this. I think that's what he's thinking about in an ideal world. One thing I'd recommend, you know, anybody listening or watching, go watch, is there's a video that was actually, narrated, or part of it was done by Johnny Bryant, who's been a head coaching candidate. And it's just about how spacing is more than just outside shooting, and spacing is also cutting and moving through the lane and things like that.
At the right time, so that you don't have two guys doing it at once while somebody's posting up, for example. But yes.
And I think that is, like, a very relevant thing for the Nuggets, is they are not the best shooting team, either by volume, I guess you should say. They're pretty good by percentage.
At least in the regular season.
Yes. But they can really create more spacing by doing other things. And I think being able to attack off the dribble and also cutting are just some of those things that the Nuggets can look at and say, we can do a better job of this going forward. And then the question is, do we have the personnel to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question. Sorry, I can't see that. Okay, who are some players that you've identified who would help with creation? Sexton, does Dennis Schroeder have something left? Those are two players that I'd love to have on the Nuggets, and there are various ways to try to get them. I think Dennis Schroeder is going to be a free agent this summer. Colin Sexton, you'd probably have to trade for. Yeah. But yeah, that downhill creation burden is definitely a thing. Zamora says, I agree in some sense about the dribble penetration, but Indiana, OKC, Boston all have rosters full of guys who can efficiently defend, shoot, pass, and dribble. We have so many quote-unquote specialists, and we've heard from Michael Malone, specialists don't play in the playoffs. Well, we had specialists playing in the playoffs, and unfortunately that didn't work out for us. I think Zamora makes a good point here, and we're going to talk about the actual, like, what to do with the roster. But something about Indiana in particular that I've been feeling, you do have some guys that do, like, a particular thing at a high level. But for example, Aaron Nesmith, he's a really good defender, but he's not an all NBA guy, but he can do a little bit of everything. I don't know how much I trust him to dribble, but he can slash a bit, but he can shoot, he can dribble, he can pass a little bit, and then he defends really well. And because he's not like an all NBA caliber guy at any of those things, he's on a really cheap contract. It's also I think his rookie extension, which is why it's pretty cheap. But that is, I think, part of the new meta that we're going to discuss. Obviously, Aaron Nesmith is not quite any of the Boston Celtics, who are all guys that also like do a thing at a high level, which is why all of those guys are making over $30 million a year. But the Thunder are super young. The Pacers are also pretty young, but they're not necessarily all on rookie contracts necessarily right now. Okay, so before we get to the listener questions, I wanted to get your general opinion about where the main sort of pressure point was with Denver's playoff roster. Was it more about the performances of our top three, the 4 through 6, or the 7 through 9th guy, which for the sake of argument, we'll just say it's Julian Strather here?
Yeah, I would say in the playoffs, you're probably looking at I would probably say 1 through 3 was the biggest pain point.
Yeah.
It depends on kind of how you're ordering guys. Are you ordering it by who should be your 1 through 3 or who was?
Oh, that's a good question. I left that open-ended.
Yeah, because Aaron Gordon was, I don't know if we'll ever see as good of a playoff run out of him as we just saw. That might have been the peak of Aaron Gordon in the playoffs. I hope not, but it might have been. But yeah, I think it was probably your top 3 guys, but you have to look at it and you have to say, why was that the case?
Yeah.
That's and
fair.
So, Jamal, he had a tough matchup, in that second round. That was a tough team for him to play. I think even for Jokic, it was a little bit difficult. This is not a team he's seen in the playoffs before, and he gets better as he sees.
Not a team any of them have seen, right? That's part of the benefit of being the young upstart.
Yep. And so
that is also the championship favorite.
Of course. We'll see. Hopefully it doesn't last too long that way. But I would say you probably needed more out of those guys. And then if you say your third guy is Michael Porter, you can include him in that quite obviously. But yeah, whatever way you want to order it, I think you needed more out of all those guys besides Aaron Gordon. And the question is, how can we make it so that they can provide more?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or do we need to move off of them because they simply can't provide more? I think those are the questions you have to look at. And that's probably what the front office is trying to figure out right now is, can we maximize these guys by bringing in different players? Or do we need to move off of 1 or 2 of them in order to maximize our roster? And then it kind of gets you into like, oh, well, maybe if our players 6 through 9 were better during the regular season, then our 1 through 4 could have provided more in the playoffs, right? So it's all kind of connected in a way, but I think you need to find a way to maximize your top end talent.
Yeah, I like how you phrased that. How can we make it so that those guys can provide more? We did need more from them, but how can we make it so that they can provide more? One of the things I felt really from early in the season. Now look, Jamal had his worst start to the season since his rookie year in that first month. But one of the things that I think augmented his normal slow start to the season was how much worse the spacing was early in the year. It didn't really get that much better as the season went on. But the spacing, especially in pick and roll, was very different when there were 2 guys that other teams were pinching in on from the nail. He's like, I can't go anywhere. And so the reads all became very different than when it was like, and I'm not saying that this would have been different with KCP here. Maybe teams just decide after last year, like, oh, we're just going to help off KCP as well. I'm not saying that would have changed, but it is very different than last year where it's like, well, we have 2 respected shooters in the corners. We got AG and the dunker. We can just run our thing. And I think it complicated the reads, and that's not an excuse because it's like, well, you're a starting point guard, you got to figure it out. And so that's like the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Also, just like on court, what can we do to make those guys' lives easier? We, had a great breakdown of Jamal's great game 6 against OKC, where, his driving game was so, I think, essential to their victory in that game. But it helped that you had that stretch where you had a guy like Julian on the floor who just always knew where to be and could kind of play off of him as well. And I think part of what we're going to talk about with these questions is how the various members of this team fit together in addition to just individual performances. Okay. First question here actually is from my normal co-host and producer of the show, Will, who is behind the curtain as the Wizard of Oz today. He's had a concern that the identity of NBA Finals teams in just this season between the Thunder and the Pacers means that teams are basically screwed if their best player is past their rookie scale extension. Jokic has started his Supermax. Jamal is about to start his veteran max contract as well. So first question is Denver just screwed because their best guys are already on their veteran max contracts and they can't go 11 deep like the Thunder and the Pacers can?
I don't think they're simply just screwed, but it makes things really hard when you have multiple guys that are overpaid by a pretty significant amount. And so I think for both Porter and Murray, I think they're probably both about like $10 million overpaid over what they should be. And then you take into account a guy like Zeke, who you wrote about recently, and he's
heard extensively about.
Right. And he's making, $6 million more than he should be. And so you just start stacking problems.
Yeah. Because it's one thing, like, I think every roster has guys that are overpaid. Every roster. Even, like, teams that are, that have very expensive rosters. They have a couple of guys that are overpaid. But like you said, the stacking of it, especially for a team that's sort of playing on these margins as they try to build a roster, is just like, man, if even one of these things was different, there's so much more that we'd be able to do in building out the roster around these guys. If any one of these contracts was like, to the value that the player is bringing to the team.
Right. And so I think it's when you start stacking so many of them on top of each other, that's when it starts to become a real issue. And that's when you do get kind of screwed. And so, it's part of what I pointed out in my report is that usually when you have contracts like that, you can attach some picks and you can get a player that's either making more like what they should or a better player overall. But the problem is that this front office was investing those picks into young players instead of getting proven products. And that's part of what I talked about is that strategy, you need to be hitting on your first round picks every single year, and they need to be contributing pretty much right away. And the fact of the matter is that just didn't happen. And so are the Nuggets screwed? I would say no. And especially not because, not all their guys are on rookie scale contracts. Does that make life easier? Yes, it does. Yeah. But I think
when you're the Thunder and you have $30 million in cap space that you can just throw at Isaiah Hartenstein in free agency, I think that makes your life a little bit easier. Yeah. But
there's a lot of different ways to build a roster though. And, I think they can figure out a good way to do it. Does it look different than what the Thunder are doing? Yes, of course. But that's not to say it's wrong or that it can't work. So.
All right. Okay, so I'll just answer this next question from Neck Hoops on Twitter, who asks a related question. Why are they comparing the Pacers and OKC roster building to Denver? Denver is 3 years ahead of them and can't go back. They wanted chips so people got paid. I mean, that's just what happened. Neck is totally right there. He also says once OKC second and third best players get paid, their roster won't look nearly as good or deep. I agree with that. And they won't be able to pay a guy like Caruso $18 million a year to come off the bench. I will say by the time you get there, you will be paying bench players $18 million a year, but it'll be a smaller portion of the cap by then. So you're totally on track with that as well. I do think there's something to, in terms of like a league-wide trend, NBA stars being better younger. Like, you just don't tend to see a guy like Tyrese Halliburton being as good as he is at 23 years old, playing at an MVP caliber in the NBA playoffs to help get his team to the finals. So I don't necessarily buy into the logic that it's just about depth. Like, I think that the fact that SGA and Halliburton in the playoffs has been playing at an MVP caliber, just in a different way than SGA, like, it's the playmaking. And the other thing is that I think talent is so high in the league right now that you just have so many awesome role players that the teams that can afford the best role players are going to look super deep, right? But that also means that if your best guy on your team is having a slightly off game or series, you can still survive that. Whereas in the past that wasn't the case, because the gap between not just the best players in the league and then like the next tier of guys was massive. You know, when it was like LeBron, Steph versus like, you know, whoever else under them. And like, obviously we have Jokic, Giannis, now we have SGA, Luka. But then like that next tier of guys are all guys where you're like, yeah, that guy could be the best guy in a playoff series. Donovan Mitchell, you know, Devin Booker, Tyrese Halliburton, Anthony Edwards, right? But then those talented role players also give you more margin for error if those like young but super talented guys that aren't quite like the MVP caliber guys are having an off series too. So, yeah, I just wanted to get to that. Okay. So we're going to talk about Jake's piece here and some of his proposals for blowing up the Nuggets core. If what you want to do is maximize depth and flexibility, because you might like make a move that's like a precursor to another move where you want to, you know, upgrade something. I think there are 3 different levels of trades that are being proposed across Nuggets fandom. There are trades that are targeting a specific player or archetype of player needed to fill the roster. I think that's something that they did when they went after KCP in 2022. They were looking for an athletic screen navigating guard. Maybe I'm putting too much, giving them too much credit for that, but I think that was a good move, and I don't think they just got lucky there, because they had apparently been, you know, targeting KCP for a couple of years. So I think that that's just like a obvious good fit next to Jokic, right? They haven't done a trade like this since. And there were some that were proposed, you know, in the course of this show, where we're talking about like, man, if we could just improve the creation off the dribble and general dribble penetration around this team, like that could add a dynamism to this roster. Another type of trade is just trying to create a certain kind of salary balance at the roster, which is part of what we're talking about, where, for example, you're trying to sell off MPJ for parts, with some, but not the most. The priority isn't necessarily who comes back, as long as they're playable and they have their contracts are broken up more to kind of, again, create that salary balance. The last category of trade that I've got here is what I've termed rampant trade thirst, which is people basically saying this roster needs a retool, get these guys off my team, doesn't matter how we get there. I've seen MPJ for Miles Bridges ideas. I've seen this multiple times. This particular one just bothers me a lot, where you're just like, guys, I don't care what you think about MPJ. Like, this is just not it. And I do think the root cause, the sort of driver of these, you know, this desire within the fan base is the fact that there has been a lack of trades that are targeting a thing to help improve the roster. They've sort of allowed this championship caliber team to degrade along the edges without really, you know, replacing those things. And some of that erosion has been intentional. Like we said, like they don't bring back Justin Holiday because they don't want anybody eating into Peyton Watson's, you know, playoff minutes, for example. But then it's like the same old issues that are continuously ignored and deteriorating over the last few years, which, you know, some of them predated my Nuggets fandom, which started in 2023. backup center and having some kind of consistent offense off the bench, for example. I think Indiana did a good job of targeting guys like, again, Aaron Nesmith and then Obi Toppin, which they were like, he's a lob threat and he runs. He can be on our team, even if he doesn't fit in New York's system, which is not a comment necessarily on New York's system. It's just like, this guy fits our system, right? Jake's guide, his Nuggets offseason guide, included these mock off seasons, and some of them included breaking up the core, and some of them included, especially to get like salary balance. But some of them are also about, targeting to get some specific guys that can help sort of along the edges of this team. Preface this discussion by saying Josh Kroenke isn't letting go of the core. I don't think that he's going to do anything with our top 4 players right now without giving them another chance to run it back one more time. I'm skeptical of this plan if the quote unquote support that they're going to put around these guys is all about the internal development of these players. I thought that this last season should have been the one where they get that support, and we call it this last dance, where they do have the help that they need around them. And thus there are no excuses for not getting it done. But then we have a civil war between the GM and the head coach. And now all Josh can talk about is alignment. And we also know that I don't think that the, 6 through whatever of the roster was enough to help get them through this run. So there are too many excuses sort of floating around because of the neglect of the roster. But yep. I want to center our discussion around the mock off seasons that do involve trading one of the core, because I want to show what that would look like. Will, if you could bring up the MPJ trade to the Bulls. I'll be honest, Jake, I wasn't the biggest fan of these particular mock off seasons in your guide, and some of them are like nitpicky, and we're going to talk about the nitpicks mostly. But for me personally, I don't think that it's not that I agree with Josh that the core didn't get like a fair shake necessarily with this last season, because I think they contributed to it, if we're being honest. Like, players playing with that level of apathy isn't just on the coaches, for example. Mm-hmm. But I would feel better if I didn't feel like a lot of these resulted in another gap year for Nikola Jokic's prime, where I don't think that what we're getting immediately makes us a contender. But I also understand that part of what you're trying to accomplish is sort of creating some more flexibility so that other moves can be made down the line. All right. So I'll ask you to explain your first one here, where you trade MPJ to the Bulls to try to create some depth on this roster.
Yep. So this trade is kind of what would I say? Probably the thing you hear most from people around like Nuggets media is, oh, we need to break up the Michael Porter contract into multiple playable players. This is kind of one of the deals I identified as possibly doing that. And so Kevin Huerter, Ayo Dosunmu, those guys are probably playing right away. And then you're also taking on some bad money in Patrick Williams.
Yeah, it's pretty bad money.
Yes, it is. And his deal goes another 4 years.
Did you know they gave him a player option?
Yes, unfortunately I did. Like, but yeah, I think his patience, or I guess the front office's patience with him, is worn pretty thin. It was a pretty rough year there for him, and I think they're pretty frustrated with him. And so you're able to get him back, and you get off some bad money in Zeke, and then you're also trading a first-round pick, but getting a second back. So you're getting 2 rotation players back for sending out 1. And maybe if you're a really big Patrick Williams fan, you think, hey, maybe we got a 3rd rotation player eventually. I don't know. I wouldn't count on it, but it's a possibility.
So I agree with you that you're obviously getting at least 2 rotation players back for sending out 1. But let me give you my arguments for not including the 2031 first in this deal. MPJ is the best player in this deal. I don't think anybody can credibly argue that unless they're the biggest Patrick Williams fan on the planet. And I think the 2031 first round pick is very clearly the best asset in the deal as well, right? The future first when Jokic is going to be God knows how old. I don't feel like doing math right now. And who knows where the Nuggets will be at that point. Like, we don't know if Jokic will be here, for example. I do think that the reason you're including the 2031 first in this deal is essentially to salary dump Zeke Najee's contract, because I don't think that giving the Bulls, like, yeah, MPJ has like $7 million more left on his deal than Patrick Williams is, but it's over fewer years. So they just know that money's gonna be expiring sooner, and just they could even move it if they wanted to. Mm-hmm. So that is my hesitation with particularly including the 2031 first here. Otherwise, like, I get you have the added benefit of adding another shooter with Kevin Huerter, and then you get another ball handler off the bench that can help smooth out some of the issues we've had with these staggered lineups, even with Jokic on the floor. Like, I've been talking about this Russ, Peyton, Jokic trio all season long, just like monitoring it through the lineup data, and it's been rough. And part of that is because of the lack of shooting that we have on the roster outside of rookie, basically, Julian Strother, who has his own issues as a young player right now. So I get that, and you again add that depth and just be able to smooth out the rotation a little bit more. Do you want to talk a little bit about in this mock off season, or I'll just have it listed here. So you fill out the depth chart after making this move by trading into the second round to draft center Amari Williams to try to get an actual backup center in the pipeline. We don't have one right now. A lot of people are talking about Deron Holmes. The organization does not see him as a center. Sure, I don't know that he sees himself as a center at the NBA level, and I don't see him as a center at the NBA level. He's actually slightly smaller than Zeke. He's also coming off an Achilles injury, and you don't, want to throw that guy into a situation where he's playing backup center for NBA and at the NBA level in his first year. You also signed Bruce to a taxpayer MLE, and you bring in Mason Plumlee on a minimum contract. In your scenarios, actually, in both of them, this and the next that we're going to talk about, you have Russ, DJ, and Vlatko all being gone in free agency. And then Dario being bought out and stretched, like waived and stretched, basically. Mm-hmm. Why do you think Russ won't be back next year? Or do you? Maybe this was just for the purpose of the mock-off season.
I think if I were to put like a percentage odds on it, I think there's probably like 40% chance he's back and 60% that he's not. So it's not that I think he's for sure gone. I think it was mostly just for purposes of these mock off seasons that he wasn't back. I had some others that I cut out where he was back, but I think the main reasoning would be I think he's going to opt out of that player option because if he signs a new minimum deal, he'll get a little bit more money. And I just think I could see the Nuggets moving in a slightly different direction. That's the way I lean. So it's not like there's no way they're going to bring Russ back. I don't think so. It's not that as much as I lean that way, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's back.
Yeah. Just a quick one for anybody that has like super minutial sort of questions that they want to throw into the chat for Jake. Throw those in right now, because I know Jake has a hard out in about 15 minutes. So I want to try to get to the questions that we need you for, and then don't worry for everybody that sent in questions. I will finish all of the mailbag questions after Jake has to go, but I want to get to the ones that we need our CBA expert to answer. Okay, so the next trade that you have in here is a trade of Jamal to the Raptors. Will, if you could pull that one up here. Why don't you explain this one briefly? It's a 3-team deal to try to get this one done. And it's centered around us getting Emmanuel quickly, basically, as our new lead guard.
Yep. So this one is sort of rebalancing of your salaries, I guess, like you mentioned a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I tried to identify in these reports teams that I think would actually take the Nuggets players. And the three that I identified for Jamal were Toronto, Orlando, and Sacramento. I thought those were three teams that you could make an argument that Jamal makes sense for them in different ways for each franchise. And so this one is kind of trying to find like a player who is not as good as Jamal. You're going to look at this deal and it's going to feel like a downgrade, and it probably is a downgrade immediately. But you're hoping that you can bring out the best in a player. And so I think that's kind of what you're hoping here with Quickly. And in addition, this is a way to do it without giving up any draft capital.
Yeah, that
So,
was a big one that I noticed with this deal too. And you get off the Zeke and Dario deals without giving up
yep,
draft capital. Obviously, you have to give up your second best player, and like
yep.
you said, it is pretty. I think I don't know how many people would agree that it or wouldn't agree that it is a downgrade.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you have to think of it in a way as we're cleaning up our books. We're getting a guy who is not as good of a player as Jamal, but can maybe develop into a similar type of player. And we're cleaning up our books without giving up that draft capital. So the downgrade from Jamal to Quickly is helping you clean your books. And you're also getting a couple possible rotation players here in Ochai Agbaji and Marcus Smart, who I don't know how much Smart has left in the tank.
Yeah.
Probably not a lot. But I believe he's only got one more year on his deal. So it's, just a short-term thing to try with him. But Quickly is kind of the main piece where if you think there's any chance Jokic can bring out the best in him and he can stay healthy, it probably ends up not looking as terrible in a few years. But, if you're not a believer in that, I can totally understand not wanting this deal at all.
Yeah. And then in this one, you fill out the depth chart by signing Chris Boucher to a taxpayer MLE. Again, Russ, DJ, Vlatko are gone in free agency, and then you sign Jayshawn Tate and Alex Len on minimums. My nitpick with this one here is that I'm gonna be honest here. I'd rather have DJ than Alex Len, just straight up. I think Alex Len is. I think DJ is that much better that I'll take the fewer games from him than the any minutes of Alex Len. Yeah, so that was an interesting one, and I think that the point that you made earlier in the show about the way that this approach with trading all these future firsts to trade earlier into these or trade into these drafts to draft young guys that could fill out the roster has we're paying the piper in multiple ways, because it's not just about roster rebalance, but if you wanted to upgrade positions, like if you wanted to upgrade Jamal, or if you wanted to just straight up upgrade from MPJ, whether that is just a better player on a similar contract or a similar caliber player on a better contract, not having that draft capital to do that sort of leads you to a place where you are almost forced into a gap year, another one, if you wanted to retool, and that's the price you pay versus the price being paid being future draft capital, right? So that's an interesting sort of trade-off that they've put they've put themselves into this position that I don't think they necessarily foresaw, which I get it, everyone thinks their plan's gonna work. Right. Okay, so
I told someone recently too, just kind of revolving around that. We were talking about it and I was like, well, if you took away Strother and Tyson and Pickett, you'd still have that 29 first, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And if you have that 29 first, now you're talking about being able to trade two of them. And now you're talking about hey, maybe we can get Kevin Durant without giving up Jamal Murray. It kind of it doesn't get you into Giannis conversations or anything, but it does get
unless
you
he
into
wants to go.
conversations.
But yeah, I agree.
So.
Okay, so I'm just going through the rest of the questions to make sure we can get to the very Jake specific ones here. Well, if you could pull up the Manny Ramirez trade. So we have a question from Manny Ramirez or Baldhead Slick 41 on Twitter. He says, my thinking is the Nuggets need to take a money ball approach. How do we trade Jamal and MPJ but recreate their production with cheaper contracts and create depth? So in this one, they're trading Jamal to the Jazz for John Collins and Colin Sexton. Lots of Collins in there. My first thought to this is that I think trying to replace production alone in the game of basketball, which is like a pretty like delicate team sport, is like there has to be a balance there because fit matters so much. Like that's something that we talked about when it came to the playoff roster. The issue wasn't just production; it was like these players being able to know what to do to play off of each other when they've shared the floor. Not to say that there's any particular fit issue with these players. Oh, okay. Jake has a little bit more time, people, so we can take a couple more questions. Fit matters. I think that Collins and Sexton probably fit with Jokic, but my question is whether they fit with AG. Especially John Collins. Like, does he come off the bench, or do you see him starting next to AG? Are we going jumbo? So Manny's question is, do the Jazz say yes? And I don't know. So we've gotten some interesting comments from their new GM, Austin Ainge, who was just named GM a couple days ago, saying that the Jazz won't be tanking next year. But I don't know that like a Jamal Murray is the kind of player that they're targeting. I don't know that he's not the kind of player that they'd be targeting. So do you have any thoughts on that one, Jake?
Yeah, I would probably lean towards Jamal Murray not being the type of player that they would take right now. They have a lot of high things to say about Keontae George. And I think they'd like to see what he can do for another year. Jamal's money being so long-term, I think probably isn't very attractive to a team like the Jazz, where like they're so early in this process of trying to contend now that like if you go and lock yourself into like a big long deal like that, it can get, that can cause a lot of issues. So I don't think Jamal's the type of player they target. In my report, I did have a trade that was Michael Porter there for Collins and Sexton. And I think Collins can play in the starting lineup next to Gordon. Not as good of a shooter as MPJ, but he can make up for some of it with what he can do with the ball in his hands, I think. So, I mean,
I read that and I was kind of like, do I want the ball in John Collins' hands a lot? I don't know.
Probably not.
I mean,
but
yeah.
if you throw him a grenade or something, right, I think he can do a little more with it than Michael Porter can. And so he's a different player than Michael Porter for sure. And if Aaron Gordon takes a big step back next year from beyond the arc, you might be looking at some trouble. So there's some risk there for sure. But yeah, just to kind of go back to the trade that was proposed there, I'd say they'd probably say no for taking on Jamal there to Utah. But Sexton and Collins, definitely gettable. I don't think either of them have super high value, and I think they're both gettable.
I think Ainge just wants to be able to get something for those guys, especially John Collins, who, gosh, it was very soon after I started following this stuff more deeply that I remember Ainge trading for John Collins from the Hawks, and it was like, okay, this is clearly like let's rehab his value and try to flip him for something big, and it's been like a couple of years now, so he's probably like, I just want to get something for this guy, right? Okay, let's go to this question from PR Morphine, who asks, I'd like to know the most advantageous but realistic scenario for Denver to trade Jamal Murray for Jalen Suggs. Isaac Suggs doesn't quite work, but it's close. Quote, we need to get out from under that contract while there's still a positive return on it, even if it's 75 cents on the dollar. I'd like to preface this by saying I do not agree with Patrick here, but I wanted to, give this idea some some thought here. I will say I understand being frustrated with Jamal and thinking they won't be able to win another championship with him, especially on his next contract, which kicks in next year. Even if I disagree vehemently with the idea that we should be trying to get 75 cents on the dollar for our second best player. I just think that the drop off from him is steeper than you think when you're not talking about trying to upgrade your sort of second option. And I'm not even talking about it necessarily having to be a guard even. That being said, as an Orlando Magic fan myself, I think Jamal is just about the best possible fit for what the Magic need right now. They've talked about wanting to have proven shot making. And their offense is, very sad. And having somebody that is Jamal's caliber of playmaker, I think could, help with just getting things a bit more connected there. And they won't even have to play faster because Jamal's not going to make them do that. Yeah. So, Will, if you could bring up the Jamal Magic trade that I sort of whipped up trying to answer this question. I have Jamal going to Orlando along with Zeke and Hunter. So in this trade, Denver gets back Jalen Suggs, Cole Anthony, and Goga Bitadze instead of Jonathan Isaac. And Orlando ends up waiving Gary Harris to make the money work. And part of the reason for that is that Orlando has to take $300,000 more back than they give up, which hard caps them at the first apron. So they have to get under that. And waiving Gary Harris actually gets them well below that. So they could just end up re-signing him on a minimum, or Denver could sign him on a minimum and Gary could come home. I think that it's a pretty fair deal if you think that Jamal's contract is that bad, because Orlando ends up getting a guy who was the number 2 on a championship team not too long ago. He's quote unquote playoff proven and fits their needs, like I said, and can scale up or down next to other higher usage creators next to in Franz and Paolo. And he could be their sort of slightly younger Fred VanVleet for what he did with Houston, right? But worse defensively, but a better shot maker. Denver gets worse, but in Patrick's fantasy here, they get off of Jamal's deal and Zeke's and gain a backup center without having to give up a pick. What do you think about this one, Jake?
Yeah, so Suggs for Murray was like one of the very first trades I ever looked at this summer. Mm-hmm. And I kind of came down to not including it because I don't like Suggs as a 1-for-1 replacement for Jamal. Yeah. Would I want Suggs on the Nuggets? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. He could be our Derek White.
Yeah. But you need more of a playmaking point guard than Suggs. I don't think you could put Suggs next to Christian and have a very healthy offense. I think it would be pretty rough. So I think that trade, value-wise and stuff, I think it works good. I would say, just speaking from a Nuggets perspective, I'd be curious what type of three-team deals they could maybe do, where Suggs goes to a third team, Murray goes to Orlando, and Denver gets a more suitable replacement point guard from whatever that third team is. So I think there's definitely some framework there that makes sense, and that trade you had value-wise makes total sense to me. I would just have concerns about the fit after.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And like we said, a lot of these deals, whether it's a 3-teamer or not, really, because whoever you get from a third team for Jalen Suggs is probably not going to be Jamal's caliber of player, even if they're on a better contract, perhaps. And maybe they could elevate their game next to Jokic. But you're talking about a downgrade in all probabilities in most of these scenarios. And ideally, what you're looking at is you're competitive enough in the immediate term, and then you have a bit more flexibility to make another move down the line, is what you're sort of hoping for from these deals.
Yeah, and I think this is all probably, I really don't think they're going to trade Jamal, so there's probably not a lot to this. Yeah. But if they were to trade Jamal, I just don't see them being able to make an upgrade this summer unless you're the type of person that thinks Zach LaVine is an upgrade, right? Which I think most people would say no.
Well, I don't know. Not right now. There's a lot of people that are very mad at Jamal. So I think you'd find a lot of people that agree, but I don't.
So, so yeah, probably no upgrades available this summer with Jamal. But yeah, I mean, like this least step down would be like a player like Suggs or a player like Zach LaVine or yeah, someone in that caliber.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions from the chat that Will's going to bring up here. Okay, first one from, does that say? Oh, I thought that said sarcasm. MSM. Okay. You know what you're doing there. Just curious what you both think about Zeke and Vlatko. That in a form of a question.
Well, I can go first because I'll be harsher.
Okay, please.
I don't think Vlatko's an NBA player.
Oh man, you just stabbed CT Fazio in the heart.
I know. I'm sorry. I get having him on the roster for other reasons. Don't think he's an NBA player. Zeke has an outside shot at maybe becoming a rotation player, but I would still doubt it. He's not a good enough screener for his size. Shot can be inconsistent, not a great rebounder. I mean, there's things there that are promising, and that's why I'd probably give him an outside shot at becoming a rotation guy. But if you ask me what way I'm leaning now, I would say sort of an end of bench player that maybe gets used sparingly. So,
yeah, agreed. Okay, how many 2025 draft picks from Todd Houston could we get if we traded our entire bench, including Russ and Sarge, assuming they opt in? Our 2031 unprotected first round pick swaps in. So they want to trade our entire bench alongside our 2020 or 2031 pick swaps in 26, 28, and 2030.
Well, that is a crazy question.
It is a crazy question, but it's sort of an extreme version of my tinfoil hat salary dump theory where they use a future first to trade into this draft, but they're dumping the entire bench and using all of their future draft capital to trade well into this draft, I guess, just multiple times.
I will say 3 first-round picks is what you could get. I think you could get 2 for the 2031 first. And that's
and then those other pick swaps are just not valuable because Jokic will still be a Denver Nugget.
Yeah, and I think you get 1 first-round pick kind of for the combined value of Watson and Strawther. Holmes probably not really holding first-round value at this point. The swaps aren't worth a first-rounder. So, yeah, we'll say 3. That's my answer.
Actually, now that you mentioned the combined value of Watson and Strawther with the salary dumps, I think you could get 4, but 2 of them would be very like the Brooklyn's worst 2 of the 5 that they own in this draft, and they'd be like, oh yeah, we'll take a flyer on these guys. Zamora asks, Squatch, what is a CBA rule everybody gets wrong, or you're just tired of explaining to people? I love this question.
Oh man. Probably just sign and trades overall. A lot of people think that you can get a guy via sign and trade, but it's really not the case. You have to stay under the first apron if you're going to do that.
Yes, because if you participate on the receiving end of a sign and trade where you're trying to get the player that is the free agent, you become hard capped at the first apron.
Yep. And now there's even rules where if you sign and trade a player away, if you get a player back, now you're hard capped at the second apron.
Yeah.
And
just because they're not letting second apron teams do anything unless it's shedding salary.
And then there's also rules. I don't have to explain this one really. The last time I did was when Jeremy Grant left Denver. But there's a rule that's called base year compensation that comes into play with sign and trades where
I actually talked about that in the Zeke piece, by the way.
Yeah, where the outgoing value is not the same as the actual contract they're signing. So I would just say sign and trades overall. That would be my answer to that one.
Yeah, it's because they don't make sense. I hate the dollar for dollar matching rules, by the way.
Yeah.
Like that Orlando Magic trade, I'm like, really? Orlando has to be hard capped at the first apron because they took back $300,000 more in salary. I don't think they should have gotten rid of the buffers. Just like make them small buffers, because it just makes any trade impossible unless you bring in a third team to, take on some additional smaller salary.
Totally agree.
Okay, one last question for you, Jake, before you have to skedaddle. We got a question from Jokic Collector. He says, how much would it cost to buy a second round pick? I don't actually know the answer to this, because it depends on where the pick is, right?
Yeah. A lot of times those types of things aren't really like publicized.
Mm-hmm.
How much cash is going back and forth in those
Right,
deals.
they just say cash.
Yep, just as cash considerations.
Yeah.
One of the best tradable pieces of all time, right?
Yeah.
I think so. Nowadays, I think we're around about $6 million is what you can trade every year during the season, and that resets at the beginning of the next cap year and everything. I think like a very low second round pick, we're probably talking about like a couple $1,000,000. So,
So pretty low, you mean like the late 40s and 50s? That low?
Probably 50s.
Okay, yeah,
probably
50s.
So, yeah, that's probably be my estimate. If anybody ever finds out, I think back in the day, the Nuggets sold the Rudy Gobert pick for cash considerations, which was a first round pick. I'm not sure if that number was ever publicized, but that would be an interesting one for someone to research if they ever do look at it.
I need to find these things out. No, I love that. All right, Jake, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. We love talking about your off-season guide. Everybody should check it out. It's still relevant all summer long. Jake has a lot of great information in there, and it is very both informative and, just a great, I think, conversation starter. The mock off seasons also include deals that are smaller margin deals and things that we're going to be talking about here all summer. I wanted to focus this show on, a topic of conversation that had been sort of bubbling to the surface more recently, which is just what would a bigger blow up kind of move look like. But we're also going to be talking throughout the summer about what is actually sort of within the realm of possibility, given how, connected Josh seems to be with the current core. So thank you for helping to guide that discussion, Jake.
Yeah.
If you want to direct the people to any of the work that you do, or maybe some of the data stuff that you do that you want people to check out with your company that you work for.
Yeah, I mean, probably the best way to follow my stuff is just on my Twitter/X feed, which is just the Stat Squatch. Most of my stuff will be on there. I am working on kind of a pretty big NBA, CBA database type project.
Ooh, I love it. I love it.
Months in the making, and probably will be many more months in the making. So whenever that one's finally ready to go public, I'll certainly share it, and it'll probably be there on my Twitter feed.
Awesome. Okay, everybody go follow Jake. We're gonna just cut to a different screen in a second while we sort of retool the screen to just be me, so I can finish answering the last few questions. But thanks a lot, Jake.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Good to talk to you.
Yay. Still here. We're just going to retool for a second while we get to the single screen, and then I can answer more questions from the chat, as well as a couple more of the questions that people sent in. Actually, Will, you could unmute yourself now. You don't have to be the wizard behind the curtain anymore, or you could at least be the voice.
Yes, I can join in.
He does exist, guys. On all these shows where he's not on the camera, he's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. I wonder if people wondered, like, where did Will go? I've gotten that question before, by the way. Do you still do the show with that guy? I'm like, yes. Every show. I can't do the show without it.
Yes, indeed.
We got a lot of really interesting questions from the chat. I love all the cap nerds that we get in here that are asking these interesting questions. All right, we are reframing things right now.
This is a live look at our production. Behind the scenes production. Here we are.
This is the magic of Hollywood.
Here I am.
Okay, yay, okay. And now your name is Jake Coyne.
Yes,
okay.
I'm the new Jake.
Awesome. So the next question we got here, and Will, you can chime in on these too.
Yeah.
Question from Denver D. Mark asks, how would you feel about a Desmond Bane trade to Denver? I said, so Desmond had like many guards last season. And this was like an interesting phenomenon I might dig into for another piece if I just ever decide that I want to write something again. I don't think that Memphis is looking to move him, but he did have a bit of a down year last year. So if they are, it may be a buy low opportunity if you believe in a bounce back from him. He has 4 years left on his deal with no options on money that's similar to MPJ's. So that's probably the deal you'd be looking to make. Personally, I'd probably prefer to keep the powder dry for a bit more of a wing upgrade, because Bane is a wing, but he's like a smaller wing, bigger guard kind of guy. But I don't think that this is an unreasonable target at all. Will, how do you feel about Desmond Bane?
Oh, man, I think Desmond Bane's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm
When
just
he's
curious,
good.
how the hell do you get him?
Well, you'd trade MPJ. This is like if Memphis was looking to move him, and it would be like MPJ out, and Memphis has a bit more flexibility because MPJ only has 2 years left on his deal compared to the 4 with Desmond's. And maybe they see it as not that big of a downgrade if they're like, well, Jaw's going to have the ball more in his hands more anyway. That's like, you'd have to, it relies on Memphis sort of looking to, they're the same age, by the way. Desmond's not, I thought he was younger, but they're the same age. Like, I think Desmond's actually older by a couple of months. So it's not like him. Yeah. And both of them, like, who knows how Memphis assesses his upside. We did see him take more on-ball responsibility during the year that Jaw was out with both the suspension and then subsequent injuries. But it also, like, didn't go well. Like, there's a reason that the Grizzlies didn't, win that many games that year. The playmaking, I think, regressed even from where it was that year. But it's, again, like, would that be an upgrade on MPJ? Probably. But is that the kind of player you're going after? I don't think it's an unreasonable target.
Yeah, depends on their outlook and everything for the Grizzlies. I think they could get a lot better for Desmond Bane than MPJ, personally.
Right, I agree with that. That's why you'd have to rely on them sort of not believing that he bounces back from this last season. But they probably do because he's their guy. That's how teams operate these days, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, our next question here is from Corner Store 64. There's a 3-parter. If CB does want 3 years, $100 million, do you throw him in the MPJ trade for Trey Murphy, and who do we get back? Potential 3-team scenarios. This one is a little bit complicated because I didn't come up with 3-team scenarios for this one. I actually think if Christian actually wants 3 years, $100 million, so like a little over $33 million a year, his time in Denver should be done, because that is about a 30% raise on what Jaden McDaniels makes. And I don't think that Christian has been better than Jaden McDaniels. He's not an all defense caliber defender. You could argue he's better on offense in some ways, like transition, but I think Jaden is a little bit more versatile than that. He really took a leap this year. So I'm sort of comping those two players that are sort of fifth options within their systems and have to do sort of dirty work things as well. I do think if you believe in Christian's upside, you want him on a 4-year deal because you want him locked in like longer term, like at least a 4-year deal. You are allowed to sign guys to 5-year deals now, by the way, that are not, even if you don't pay them like the designated rookie max deals that are like for the Jaws and the Desmond Bains of the world, you can sign smaller deals for longer too. I haven't seen a deal like that outside of Oklahoma City, who just signed Aaron Wiggins for like a long-term deal that includes team options and things like that. So curious about if other teams are going to take advantage of that rule. So yeah, if you believe in Christian's upside, you want him on a longer deal than the 3 years, $100 million. And if you don't believe in his upside, he shouldn't be making anywhere near that money. So that deal I don't think makes sense in either framework. And what you'd want if you don't believe in his upside, where you're like, he's basically what he's going to be, then you probably just give him or want to offer him money that is a slight raise on what Josh Hart is making, for example, because that's still like his NBA comp for me. I think Christian and Josh Hart were pretty much equal players in this last playoffs, which says more about Josh Hart than Christian, because I don't think that Christian was like particularly great in the playoffs, although he had his moments. And Christian's also younger, so he'd make a little bit more than what Josh is making, which is about $20 million a year. Okay, that was a lot of words, but that's how I look at sort of assessing value for these contracts. I don't work in the NBA. I don't work in a front office that is making these decisions every day. All I can do is say, like, okay, who are the guys that operate in similar roles to what this guy is going to be? What do they make? What are some of the mitigating factors like age, durability, things like that can, kind of toggle between or sort of operate within like a buffer around the number that those comparable players are making. Next question from Corner Store is, if we get Trey Murphy and we lose Christian and MPJ, what would be our new starting 5? You're probably sliding Peyton into the starting lineup if you're trading 2 starters and only getting 1 player back. So this is a good question for you, Will. Actually, I think that part of the reason that Christian isn't going to be going anywhere this summer is because Peyton would have to slide up into whatever spot is left open by Christian leaving, unless you've got just like a 1-for-1 guy for Christian. But Christian's not going to be thrown into another deal as like a sweetener, for example. But my question is, do you think the fact that Peyton Watson hasn't taken the leap, part of the reason that they're kind of a bit more attached, the team is, to MPJ now? Because if you wanted to trade MPJ, you'd have to go for an upgrade basically at that position, because we don't really have another good small forward unless you thought that Peyton Watson could slot into that spot. So the trade ideas for MPJ are a bit more limited because you're looking at a particular position.
Yeah. Phil Brown said earlier, which I'll kind of package into this, about possibly AG playing 3 since he's shooting better. I don't think that will likely happen just because of his need for that big of a body at the 4. So I don't know that he would play 3. Depends on then who you're playing at 4.
I think I'd be more hesitant because of the defense, honestly.
Yeah, that's
like
what I mean.
I don't want AG having to guard 3s.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't know that any guy you're trading for at the 4 position is going to be able to take on the ability to guard 3s. And not that MPJ is a good, guy like navigating screens all the time and all that, but I don't want AG in that role because he's just better at what he does right now. It's good that he's versatile enough that he can take that on if he gets switched on to a guy. And everyone was like, he guarded Jalen Williams well in round 2, and to varying degrees I agree with that, or to a certain extent I agree with that, but I don't want him having to do that all the time because that's the roster.
Yeah,
right.
But that's just like one idea if you're trying to figure out how to replace MPJ at 3. Is it P1?
Yeah.
Is it AG?
Right.
Probably not AG, I don't like P1 having to be the starting 3. I think that would be a terrible idea. So whatever.
I
Trey
think
is
if he'd
forcing
had a
him into
better
that.
year, these conversations would feel very different because it wouldn't
Yeah.
feel like so much of a downgrade if you went from MPJ to a worse player, because that player would just be coming off the bench, and then you probably get something else that helps fill out your rotation, and then Peyton moves up into that starting role. But that's not been the experience with Peyton Watson this season. So I think that's another aspect of why these deals feel a bit more tense, is like, ugh, this is that much more of a downgrade because of, we haven't gotten that progression that we expected internally from Peyton Watson yet.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question from Corner Store. Very informed questions, I thought. Is it realistic to get Bruce, Chris Boucher, and or Gary Trent Jr. on veteran minimums? Oh, Todd Houston also says, I like us signing Bruce Brown and Chris Boucher. I think no, because those guys are probably at least taxpayer MLE guys. I say at least just to be kind. They're probably just tax MLE guys. I could see, ironically here, I wrote that Bruce is probably the most likely of the three that you'd be able to get on a minimum, but it's only because he likes Denver so much. I could also easily see another team offering Bruce the full MLE, which is a little bit more than Najee Marshall got last summer, because he got part of the full MLE. I think Gary Trent Jr. is probably going to get a similar raise to Malik Beasley. So Malik Beasley was basically what Gary Trent Jr. is this year, which was the starting two guard for the Bucks for large stretches of the season. It had a great year shooting, and then the Detroit Pistons were like, we'll give you $6 million a year and you don't have to be on a minimum anymore. And I think that's probably what Gary Trent Jr. is going to command a little bit more than the taxpayer MLE. But if he wanted to come to Denver on the taxpayer MLE, I would consider that, because I'd love to get some consistent shooting, and David Adelman would like that too.
Yeah, that's like a guy a lot of Nuggets fans wanted to put in that contract exception, but obviously we didn't do that.
Yeah.
We got Dario.
That's my thing, is like, I don't think you have to offer all these guys player options to come to Denver, but you can find like a good enough minimum guy that you're like, I really want this guy, but I don't think anyone else is going to offer him more than a minimum. So we can just beat their offer by offering the taxpayer mid-level. And we did that with Dario, to be fair. Nobody else did offer him more than a minimum, and he was almost going to go to Europe. But Calvin flew to Europe, offered him the taxpayer MLE with a player option, and convinced him to come to Denver. And here we are.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of this comment really quick before we get to our
please.
last question? Ken Goldman says, Trey Murphy, damaged goods, tore labrum, rotator cuff. Will he be ready for the season? What would it affect his shot?
I wouldn't be worried about a shot, because like when you're a shooter that's that good, you're working on that all the time, and you're going to be able to come back from that. I do think that the durability question is a real one. I was having a dialogue with someone online that says Christian is already clearly better than Trey Murphy. I disagree with that, but the thing that Christian has on him is durability. And part of these are just like freak accidents that happen. So, and things that could happen to Christian in the future too. But once enough of them build up, you sort of become more, you tend towards more, just because of, ligament things. They tend to be re-aggravated. As somebody that's had plenty of joint issues in my life, I can attest to that, even as a non-athlete. But it's just something that you'd have to consider if you wanted to trade Christian for Trey Murphy, is like, we should probably also try to get somebody in that deal that can just eat minutes, that can just be on the floor, right? Because it kind of doesn't matter how good you are if you can't play. Mm-hmm. And okay, so our last listener question, and I'm fine taking more from the chat if you find any other interesting ones, Will.
Yeah.
From Matthew Duncan, who said, who do you think are the options for the mid-level exception? So we're going to have only the taxpayer mid-level exception in all probability this summer, which is about half the full mid-level exception. So like I said earlier, I think Bruce Brown is probably somebody that they could get on the taxpayer mid-level. One of the dynamics I'm looking for this summer is if Bruce wants to come here, he probably wants the tax mid-level and not just a vet minimum. So does that mean that we just don't have the option of giving the tax mid-level to somebody else should they become an option for Denver? Also, like, who knows? Like, again, Bruce may not end up coming back here, and it could be for this reason. Like, he just gets offered a tax mid-level or a full mid-level somewhere else. Bruce, Gary Trent Jr., Chris Boucher is an option. This free agent class is actually not that intriguing to me, which is why I'm more interested generally in some smaller trade ideas. But, yeah, it's just the nature of the new CBA is the free agent classes aren't really that great outside of usually like a couple guys at the top that are going to be out of our range. So,
yeah. Okay. So a couple more questions from the chat and then we'll be done. Thank you guys if you're still here for listening. And after Jake has gone and hanging out, we love you guys. From Red and Whites, if you're still in the chat, do you think there's a chance that Chanchar, Saric, DeAndre Jordan, and Westbrook are not on the Nuggets come July? That would be 4 roster spots. I think there's a chance DeAndre Jordan and Westbrook won't be, but I'll be surprised if Westbrook isn't on some level. And then I'd be very surprised if Saric wasn't on the team just because he will probably.
I think he's taking a player option.
Yeah, he's going to opt in.
That's a free $5 billion.
At that point, you're going to be working on a trade, and that might take some time. And so we'll see. I mean, there's a chance, but I think Vlatko's probably not going to be on the team. But yeah.
I'm not so sure about it, honestly, because if you're telling Jokic our whole plan is internal development anyway, and then you take away his best friend, and he's just like, so I'm supposed to just be miserable here? I think Jokic becomes extension eligible, by the way, after the NBA Finals are over. I want to know at what point in the summer he signs his extension. I think he's going to sign it either way. I don't think he's going to wait that long. But look, he is in Serbia right now. Is Ben Tenzer going to have to fly there? I don't know that Jokic wants to docu-sign his further commitment to this franchise that, keeps putting children around him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the buyout was definitely an option. That's definitely a desperate type of thing, but it's a reasonable option to consider. And I would love to know what a new GM would think about doing something like that. That'd be something I feel like Kroenke would have more like say over. He'd be like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. But
yeah, I think Kroenke has a lot of say in a lot of things right now, and part of installing Ben Tenzer probably, hopefully within the next week, because one of the things someone pointed out to me yesterday is that KD is probably going to be traded before the NBA draft. And, theoretically, I'm not saying this will happen, probably won't. If he came to Denver's people and was like, I want to go to Denver, we don't have a general manager to like work out that, those details and like try to make that happen. If like, even if he doesn't say Denver, if Denver's just like on his short list, like we need somebody to be like advocating for that if that's something that they would be interested in. And look, it's not like nobody's working there. Like there are people working in the front office. We still have our assistant GM, Tommy Balcetis, and Ben Tenzer is acting general manager right now, interim general manager. So he could do those things, but it's kind of an unstable situation if you haven't named who the guy is, which isn't particularly attractive to free agents either, right? So I'm kind of annoyed that they haven't just named the general manager yet, even if it is just going to be Ben Tenzer. But, we'll see. We shall see.
Liz A5280, our friend from the comments in the chat, says, how many years did it take for Jokic, Murray, and MPJ to break out from their rookie statues? And she says she means, how long did it take to show they can make an impact?
I think with Jokic, it was rather early on because it was by the middle of his sophomore year after Nurkic was injured that they were like, this guy should probably be our starter. He did go back to the bench briefly, but then they're like, no, we got to trade Nurk. With Jamal, it seems like it was relatively early on too, because the whole idea behind trading Jameer Nelson was like, Jamal has to be our starting guard.
Yeah, we definitely showed like belief in Jamal before he really got to like the Jamal level that we know. But
Jamal was traded in 2016, right? Jamal was, or not traded, drafted in 2016, right?
Yeah, around there.
By the 2018 season, I think he had shown that promise. Like, and the difference is, well, Jokic is a special case. He was a 41st pick, right? Jamal is a lottery pick. You don't necessarily expect a Peyton Watson or Julian Strawther to show the level of promise that a 7th overall pick like Jamal did by, his second or third season, in terms of like, okay, this guy's going to be like a guy in this league. But that was the gamble that they made, is that Peyton Watson and Julian Strawther would have done that by now. Or at least Julian will by, say, his third year. Yeah, the Peyton Watson stuff has been slow going. But what is it? Development isn't linear?
It's definitely not linear, but it's also not a plateau, hopefully. All it is, but we don't want that. Todd brought up, I don't know how to say this individual's name.
Markovic?
But yes.
We'll just say
Markovic being mocked between picks 35-46, intriguing Serbian, 6'11", forward, 3-point sharpshooter. Well,
to replace Vlatko.
Got to get a pick.
It'd be really funny if we just brought in another Serbian to replace Vlatko and Jokic just hated him.
It would be cool to get another Serbian connection for Jokic, and I like the sound of a 6'11" 3-point shooter. Can he dribble a drive though? I probably not at that height and position, but that's what. Yeah, you and Jake had a good discussion on that earlier, the different skills that we want, and I'm sure CT Fazio will have some draft ideas. Todd's been bringing up lots of interesting names about who we could potentially draft throughout the show. So yeah, we'll look to see who we could maybe add if they even trade for more picks, or if they're just getting late second picks. We'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for those that have made it this far, we still have 29 people in the live chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
We appreciate the heck out of you guys. We got a whole new subscriber over the course of this stream.
Thank you.
But if you do like our content, please remember to click the like button, hit the subscribe button as well, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. You can leave us a review. We're on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music. The full podcast should be dropping audio within 24 hours if you want to share that out with your friends or your enemies or your family or your family's enemies. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, all our socials. Links are in the description. Probably be making more fun short segment type stuff over the summer when there are fewer games to analyze, until Summer League, of course. Really looking forward to the Summer League nuggets. But of course, the NBA Finals are, like I said, right around the corner, as in tomorrow. And those games may or may not be interesting because it's either going to be very, very interesting because the Pacers are able to keep it close, or it won't be interesting at all because the Thunder just destroy everything in their path. And always remember that winning is fun and losing sucks. Because then you have to watch the Thunder in the finals.